So we'll continue then. We've talked about how the world come of age has come about in the West, uniquely in the West, because of the heritage of the gospel. What Bonhoeffer says here is that the true heritage of the West is the heritage of Israel, therefore. The historical Jesus Christ is the continuity of Western history, and because the gospel is the message of Jesus Christ, the promised Jewish Messiah, the West's heritage stretches back to the people of Israel. That's our real history. Our real history goes back to the people of Israel. Here's a quote. Western history is by God's will inextricably bound up with the people of Israel, not just genetically, but in an honest, unceasing encounter. The Jews keep open the question of Christ. They are the sign of God's free, gracious election and of God's rejecting wrath. See the kindness and the severity of God, from Romans 11:22. Driving out the Jews from the West must result in driving out Christ with them, for Jesus Christ was a Jew. Now this is from the Ethics that he talks about here. So it is the real Jewish historical Jesus who is present in the gospel. Remember, the gospel is not an idea. The gospel is not a principle. It is an embodied human being. And it's that embodied human being, this Jewish historical Jesus. And it is the gospel that brings both God's ultimate reign and true worldliness that has appeared in the West. But the gospel is promise, not sight, and the continued presence of the Jewish people as those who are chosen but still waiting for the fulfillment preserves the tension between the ultimate and the penultimate, true faith and true worldliness. So faith in Christ means friendship with the Jewish people. It means standing in solidarity with the Jewish people who are still waiting for the Messiah, who keep that question open for us so that it isn't something that we have in our possession as a superior or supersessionist revelation from God that regards then the Jews as a rejected people, or as a people that are no longer God's chosen people. And if the West finally expels the Jewish people, then any so-called gospel that it still professes is exposed to not being the real presence of Jesus. And the tension collapses, and both faith and true worldliness will disappear. Of course, he wrote these words when the Holocaust was happening. And he knew it. So what he's saying here is, and this is a critique, although at this time he is still very, very appreciative of much of what he got from his liberal teachers. It's a real deep critique of liberal Protestantism, which shared with the more conservative mainstream Protestantism this whole idea that really the Old Testament was passé, that we were really beyond that. Once we know once we know the gospel being what? The fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, or whatever. Once we know the gospel, what do we need this Old Testament? This is superseded, see? It's just maybe a Vorstufe, that is a preliminary stage, which we can now jettison. And that was the prelude then to opening up the way toward the Holocaust. Because once you get rid of the particularity of God's chosen people and of God's choosing of his people, then you get rid of the particularity of Christ, you lose the gospel, and you also lose the world. in its reality.
You lose the dialectic.
You lose the tension. You lose the tension. And so this is, here's my question. Almost the entire West refused to rescue the Jewish people from the Holocaust. So what does that mean for the future of the West and for the Christian church in the West? What do you think it does?
Well, the evidence of the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe
Yeah.
is perhaps not a symptom of the loss of the gospel, but a precursor to it.
And even within America, the rise of anti-Semitism and the secularization is a losing sight or remembrance of our past and what happened then and what God has done for us in Christ, who begins with the promise to Abraham.
Right.
If you don't have Genesis 12, what do you have in the New Testament?
Yeah, of course, that's true. But when you look at the history of the Jews in Europe and in Christendom, and what ultimately happened, and how, well, it's a long history, and of course, racist anti-Semitism is something different than the anti-Judaism of somebody like Martin Luther. But they build on one. I mean, the racist anti-Semitism built on the anti-Judaism that we inherited from the Middle Ages and has gone all the way through. Nevertheless, I'm wondering if this doesn't mean that since Europe pretty definitively ejected the Jews, that the gospel isn't going to stay there very long either.
Like Bishop Radowski said, your average Lutheran today is probably a 35-year-old woman in South America or in Africa.
Well,
It's going to be a different world.
yeah.
Well, does this have to do with what we were talking about earlier? There's a certain self-righteousness now that I know that I am saved by faith and without works, therefore I'm a better person
Mm-hmm.
than those that don't know that.
Yeah, of course. That anything, even the gospel, can be used as a badge of pride, and as a way of gaining status and feeling superior to others. But the problem is, you see, what happened is that the gospel then became unincarnate, just a principle, just an idea. So, for example, in liberal theology, how do you deal with modernity and how do you preserve the gospel? Well, you say, well, the Bible, there's a kernel and there's a husk. The kernel is the eternal truths that are there. And the husk is the particular historical way that is carried out in the Bible. And we can discard the husk and keep the eternal truth, the timeless truths in the Bible, see? And when they did that, then you discard the particularity of God's choosing of Abraham and of God's electing his people and God's electing then that one, Jesus, and God's election of us in him, of Jews and Gentiles by reason of faith in him. And so the whole thing goes. The particularity is gone as soon as the connection with the Jewish people is lost.
And that's what Romans brings out when Paul says that just grafted on. You could be broken off and they could be grafted back on. Remember, you were picked second.
Well, that's what Bonhoeffer is talking about here. The Jewish people keep the question open. So it isn't a possession that we have, like Michael was talking about, that we can brag about. Our election is not that kind of a thing. It's contingent. It's particular. Somebody, this came to us, but it's not something we own. It's not something we can boast of. And that's what Christians have done through the centuries with regard to the Jews. They said, well, good, look, God is punishing you because you rejected the gospel and we accepted it. So why don't you accept the gospel and then you can be as good as we are, except you'll never be as good as we are because we won't ever trust that you're really true believers, right? Just like in Spain with the Moors and the Moriscos, they never believed that they were really converted.
We have pastors that
So.
are descendants of Jews, and we have
Yes.
and we have pastors on our roster that are descendants of Jews.
Yes.
And I have a parishioner who was raised Jewish, but then his mother said they were Christian Scientists, and he's now married to a Lutheran and a member of our church. But it's like he grew up in Chicago with signs that said no Jews need not apply.
Right.
Like for apartments and things.
Exactly.
This anti-Semitism that was prevalent in the world made, of course, it made it hard for people to take to heart what Hitler was doing
Right.
until after the fact when the horrors were found out.
Right.
And anti-Semitism was rampant in America as well.
Oh, of course it
during
was.
that time period.
Yeah. Of course. And I remember hearing it when I was a kid.
And was the reason for this because they did not accept Jesus as the Messiah? Was that the reason, or was there some other?
There was prejudice, there was scapegoating, there was just
Jealousy.
hatred of people because they kept to themselves and they wouldn't intermarry, and there was a suspicion that they were cheating everybody, that they helped each other and were kind of parasites off the rest of us, as us against them. It was fear, it was prejudice, it was, yeah.
One of my friends said that she hated going to school on Good Friday. She's Jewish because all the little Catholic kids would tell her, "You killed Jesus, you killed Jesus."
Oh,
And she is, just a couple years younger than me, so this was even going on in the
yeah,
60s.
right. But it may mean God is simply going to be done now with the West. The U.S. didn't do anything to help the victims of the Holocaust either. I don't know. I'm just wondering about that. And the fact that the state of Israel came into being is a sign against us. It's a sign against us of judgment.
I think your last question, what the Bonhoeffer's insights mean for Christians in relation to Jewish people, is the warning that you just said, that we hang on to the promise in Genesis 12, and I don't think it's strange. I think it makes sense that Luther was an Old Testament professor, and he lectured extensively on Genesis and Hebrews. And you just can't be a good Lutheran and not study Genesis and Hebrews.
Right. Right. But he too, of course, was infected with that anti-Semitism and would not and could not imagine simply living with the Jews as not Christian Jews. And living with that situation that Paul describes in Romans 9, 10, 11, with that kind of hope that Paul had. That this is the way God has set it up in order to include the Gentiles and to live in fear, because as you said, God could, we're grafted on, but we could be ungrafted and cut off and put them back in again. And it's all God's election. That's the thing, See that for the Jewish people, many of those who perished in the Holocaust, it was doubly horrible because they did not affirm their Jewish identity. They didn't think of themselves as Jewish. They thought of themselves as Germans or whatever, and they decided to, and that was imposed, they couldn't escape it. Once you are elected by God, you can't escape it. So the Jewish people can't escape it, their election. That's the real offense. They are chosen, we are not.
It wasn't part of the difficulty in Germany, like someone like Hildebrand, who had either a grandparent or a great-grandparent that was one that was Jewish, 1 out of 4 grandparents.
Then you were.
All it took, you were Jewish. So if his parents and he was a Christian, he was a pastor.
Yeah.
Luther wasn't against people that accepted the gospel. He got upset. In general, one might say that he was upset that they hadn't accepted the gospel once it had been rediscovered. But in this case, these are people who had accepted the gospel.
Right.
And still Hitler was coming after them. So like you say, they have no self-identity.
Well, they couldn't escape their Jewishness because Hitler and his ideology wouldn't let them escape. His hate wouldn't let them escape. And it was, well, we're not going to solve the deep mystery of the chosenness of the Jewish people and their fate in Europe here, but it's inextricably bound up with what it means to be Christian. And I can't help but think of whether, if the very existence of the state of Israel is a judgment against Western Christians, that to be a Christian Zionist is in a way to say, good, let's have the Jews go there. This is judgment. This is not the beginning of the end of the world that the Jews are back. It's not the return. They're still in exile. They're still in exile. They're still, even if they're in the Holy Land, they're in exile. Doesn't matter where they are. So the exile is not over with. Anyway, that's another thing. Bonhoeffer didn't get into that. He lived before the state of Israel was established, obviously. Anyway, the unity of the West, as I've said, consists in the maintenance of the tension between ultimate and penultimate. He says even war in medieval and early modern Western Europe, even into the 20th century to some extent, was an expression of that unity because they were not total wars. They distinguished between what was permitted and what was not permitted, what constituted just war, what constituted criminal means of warfare, and they believed that God rules this world in a penultimate way, keeping order, restraining the wicked, and he said war was always something like an appeal to divine judgment to which both sides were willing to bow. Now the idea, it's always a big offense that here everybody was supposedly Christian. They were having all these wars in Europe. How could that be? How could that be even justified? And that's what Bonhoeffer is saying, that but it wasn't total war. It was very limited war in which there was an appeal to God for his judgment as to who was right. And the outcome was considered a statement of God's judgment to which both sides were willing to bow. If you think of Lincoln's second inaugural, he has an idea like this, that this war that came about, the Civil War, was God's judgment on both North and South for the evil of slavery. every drop of blood that came from the lash had to be paid for by the blood of all those people that fought. Both sides, not just the South, both sides. So he gave a kind of a Christendom interpretation of the Civil War in order to unify the country again. See? Well, God has spoken, and it's a judgment on both sides. And so now we can move ahead. That was his idea, I think. So, I don't know, do you find this idea of the nature of war in medieval, early modern Europe convincing?
Power politics of Europe up to that point is where there was no principle involved. They just fought. Two people were allies, and a third person got, one of those two people got too strong. They had allegiance to switch.
When are you talking, what era are you talking about?
From the pre-Renaissance area up to World War II, balance of power politics that ran in Europe. It had no principle. Like
Well.
you're saying, there were Christian nations, and they changed power. England, Germany, France, and to some extent Russia just changed who they aligned themselves with,
Yeah.
and based on who was the strongest, because no principle was involved.
Well, there was a principle of trying to maintain the peace. And if one nation got too powerful, there was going to be war. And they didn't want that to happen. Nobody wanted that to happen. And of course, one of the bedrocks of diplomacy, European diplomacy, all those centuries, was keeping Germany down so they wouldn't unite, because that would be a terrible threat to the peace.
And then keeping Russia down, and then trying to keep, it was.
Well, it's an interesting theory. I'm not so sure that it's so true. I'm reading a book right now that makes the case that medieval society was actually much, much, much more violent than modern society. You're much more likely to die of violence in about the year 1000 than in the year 1800 or the year 1900 or certainly the year 2000. Even with the horrible wars in the 20th century. Well, whether that's true or not, he's not talking about levels of violence. What he's talking about is that there was some unity there involved. And there was an appeal to that unity. Now, the Reformation shattered this unity. And I think that's what you're getting at there too, Lene. The Peace of Westphalia, that ended the wars of religion, that's when Grotius is working and trying to find some basis for an international law, not based on all of us sharing this ultimate truth, which is the Christian truth.
Lewis Spitz gets at it a little bit. I think it's in the second book of his 2-volume set. But basically, while Europe was fighting amongst itself, switching like parts of Germany and France were going back and forth, one day they wake up and Russia's over there and America's over there, and they haven't been playing the game with them, and they don't know what to do. And I think that's worth not here. That's what I'm thinking about, talking about how that happened.
Yeah, they're both outsiders to Europe, yeah. Well, the Reformation, anyway, shattered that unity, although that's never what Luther intended. Luther recognized the true unity of the church did not consist in either the political power of the papacy or the political power of the emperor, but in the living Christ present in word and sacrament. And since the Pope would not be a servant of the word, the unity of the church under Rome came to an end, and the Corpus Christianum dissolved into its two authentic parts, the Corpus Christi and the world. So Christ rules his body, the church, through the word, and the sword belongs to the earthly government. And these two kingdoms are inextricably bound together until the end. It is the hidden body of Christ in both the Roman and non-Roman church that is the true unity of the West. And proper government would find its basis in that true unity, acknowledging that true unity. The 30 Years' War revealed that the political unity based on the outward unity of faith was shattered, but that hidden unity was still there, and it still exists, he thought, and is the only basis of Western unity today. Here, the guilt of Western Christendom toward Jesus Christ, which is a common guilt, should not be allowed to destroy the Western unity that exists in the name of Jesus Christ, who is called upon here as well as there. He means among Protestants as well as among Roman Catholics. So I'm really interested in presenting this in Europe and asking them what they think. What is the basis now of European unity? They have the European Union, but it's not based, or is it, ultimately based on the unity of Christendom. The hidden unity of the West is Jesus Christ. And
how does the overwhelming Islamic growth within some of these countries affect this? Denmark has decided to not allow more Muslims in because they realize that, these third world Muslims, they can't afford it because of their extensive welfare benefits, so it'll break the bank.
Right.
And, and I think England has parts that you can't even go into. You fear of your life. So how will Islamic immigration and the terrorism and things have an impact on Europe that's positive with regards to uniting around Christ, or will it have no impact? That's the question.
Well, yeah, we can talk about that's going to come up later here too, but no, that's all right. That's a natural question because the attempt has been made to unite Europe based on a kind of lowest, Well, yeah, uniting their economy and liberal democracy and toleration of minorities and differences and kind of inclusivity, which has been the watchword, of course, of recent years. So, is that enough? Isn't there is the European Union going to break apart? We certainly hope not, because of course it's been quite a remarkable run of peace in Europe, despite what happened in the Balkans, but they weren't part of the EU. So yeah, Dorothy.
Well, and then what are they going to do with all of the refugees from Africa?
Yeah, I know.
That we can't take anymore.
Right, they can't take them, but they're leaving and putting their lives at danger. Right, because things are so awful in those countries on the South Shore of the Mediterranean. Think how awful it must be for people to do that. That's also the people coming over the border here from the south, and think of the awful things they go through just to get here. People don't like to leave their homes, and come to a country where they're not wanted, where they're treated with contempt, where they don't have very many rights or no rights. But it's still way better, apparently, than what they have at home.
Homes have been taken away from them by their own
Well,
country.
the conditions for life there are so bad. They can't raise families. Apparently. I don't know. But anyway, this is a really interesting question. And I'm only on page 5, and I got 30 pages here. So now we'll get to more theology. This is all theology, of course. But religionlessness, that's a bad word. It's hard to say. Religionlessness of the world come of age. And this is really important that we get to a definition of religion, because Bonhoeffer is saying that that in the last years here, that the West has not found its unity in the gospel. Rather, there's been this whole history in the last, especially 300 years, of rejection of the gospel. And he says that's because Christianity has been interpreted as religion. And here's his definition of religion. He's under influence here of Barth, obviously. It is to interpret Christianity as religion is to speak metaphysically and individualistically. To speak metaphysically is to speak of God where human knowledge and strength fail. So such a God is by definition outside this world and is brought in as a deus ex machina, as the solution to problems that humans supposedly cannot solve themselves. So what? I am sinful and I need forgiveness, so I bring in God, right? I bring in God to forgive my sins. I'm going to die and I want to live eternally, so I bring in God. My life doesn't have meaning and I can't get over my addictions, so I'm going to bring over God because I can't do it. So God is going to come in from somewhere. And you know what a deus ex machina is? That's a device in drama where a crisis happens and the problem is not solved by some kind of a natural resolution of the plot, but a supernatural force, a God, comes on the scene and just kind of magically makes it good, right? So it comes out from, it's brought out from the sidelines and is brought onto the stage. It's God out of the machine, literally, to come and kind of make everything right. So that is the first part. So it's that the God is metaphysical. It's just what I talked about before, right? When we had this idea of God and the world. And we draw the line ourselves, and there's God. He's beyond the world, and he's everything we aren't. So he can solve the problems we can't solve, right? And then it is to speak individualistically, which is to speak of the inner life as the realm where God is needed. So in traditional terms, religion is about the salvation of one's soul. And what is the soul? The soul is the immortal essence of the self that has a natural connection to the metaphysical God because it's kind of the same stuff. It's immortal after all. So this is where you have your kind of point of contact with God. And the modern invention of the inner life since the Renaissance has prompted Christian apologists to intrude into the most intimate psychological depths of people in order to uncover their need for God. So in the reaction against, God being a natural part of our life and one that we live with all the time, is to penetrate into the inner life, to show people that in their soul, in their psyche, psychologically, that in there they really need God. Have you ever heard about somebody say, you have a God-shaped hole in you that only God can fill, right? That's what he's talking about. So I have a question here. Gerhard Forde speaks of how the Christian message has traditionally been controlled by the myth of the exiled soul, in which the immortal soul that shares in some way in the spark of divinity has become trapped in the material body, and human beings need the help supplied by divine grace in order that the soul can escape and be united with God. And why is this not Christian? It's Gnostic, of course. And we're all, what Bonhoeffer is really saying is that all along, there's always been this element, this Gnostic element that has been kind of the garb of Christianity. It's the way the gospel has been transmitted and preached and proclaimed. As the salvation of the soul in that sense, the liberation of this kind of God part of you, so that it isn't weighed down by all of our passions and our sinful flesh and so on, and can be reunited with God. And how is this idea expressed in modern individualistic and therapeutic concepts of salvation? Do you remember the new Reformation? Self-esteem.
Yeah.
Remember that one? Or what? You think of other therapeutic understandings of, I mean, that's, right? Therapeutic, what's that title? Something deism? Moralistic deism. Moralistic, yeah, right. So that, we'll help you with your anxieties, and we'll help you, and when you come to church, you'll feel better, right? And so you can cope with life a lot better if you have, spiritual resources,
Yeah.
right?
Essentially, if God becomes a 911.
Right, yeah. And
And people say they're spiritual, not religious.
right, that's what